Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Ashley, and I will be your host. Today, we are covering how a business licensed service provider can reduce risk and internal workloads, how to decide between a business licensed software and services solution, and how Avalara License Management and Avalara License Managed Services can work for you. Before we dive into that, I do have a couple housekeeping items to cover. First, just a friendly reminder that Avalara cannot provide legal tax advice, but we will answer your questions as best we can. On your screen is our safe harbor policy. Please take a moment to review that while I continue with some additional items. We are recording today's webinar, so if you want to listen to it again or share it with a colleague, you'll receive the recording within the next 24 hours. The console you're looking at can be customized, so feel free to move or resize the windows. The slides can be resized by dragging the bottom corner or downloading the PDF slide deck under additional resources. The additional resources contains a lot of great resources, including those slides, so check all those out. There are several ways to engage with the presenters and your fellow attendees today. First, if you have any questions, you can submit them using the Ask a Question box. We will save time at the end for Q&A. You may also submit any webinar troubleshooting questions in that Ask a Question box. Second, you can join our attendee chat. You'll click the icon on the bottom of your screen with the two chat bubbles, and the attendee chat will pop up. So we encourage you to introduce yourself, network, and discuss today's topic. Maybe as a starter, you can drop in where you're calling in from today. I'm calling in from Iowa. Third, you can react to the presentation by clicking on the emoji icon and reacting throughout the presentation with a thumbs up or a heart. And then lastly, if you have any technical issues, there is a question mark icon along the bottom. Or again, you can reach out using the Ask a Question box and we'll try and help you out. I do want to have a quick call out for our Avalara customers. We are hosting Avalara Crush, our customer conference in Austin from November 11th through 14th. And this conference will feature hands-on workshops, thought leadership sessions, interactive sessions to meet your peers. And there's plenty of fun along the way. So you can learn more and register at avalaracrush.com. We are offering 1 CPE credit for today's presentation. For those looking to receive the CPE credit, please note that we will ask you to respond to 3 of our 4 poll questions. The poll question will pop up on your screen for a limited amount of time, so please make sure you're ready to answer when the question appears. We ask that you don't split or tile screens on your computer, as this can affect the placement of the poll question. And then you must also attend the full duration of the webinar. Once you have met those requirements, your certificate will be available to download in the Earn Certification box on your screen. You'll click the little icon to access it, and it will pop up in a new tab. We will also send the certificate in a post-event email if you don't get a chance to download it during the webinar. Unfortunately, we are unable to provide CPE credit to those who have technology issues that prevent you from qualifying, so please reach out as soon as possible if you have any issues, and we can document those. Now, introducing today's presenters, we are joined by 2 Avalarians. First, we have Vicky Basile, Product Solution Consultant, and Andrea Jaffe, Senior Director of Professional Services. And before I pass it over to them, I will just quickly get to our first CPE poll question. So this is displaying on your screen now. And the first question is, what industry do you operate in? We have a lot of different options there, so please make your selection and we will show the results momentarily. And just a reminder, this is the first poll question and you need to answer 3 of the 4. We'll give you maybe 10 more seconds before we show the results. Okay, so here are the results, and it looks like we have a lot in manufacturing, retail, wholesale, software, and a good chunk in other that didn't fit those categories. So that's helpful for our presenters because we do have some slides later that are a little more industry focused. So thank you for answering that poll question. I'll move us on to the agenda and I'll pass it over to Vicki.
Thanks, Ashley. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Welcome, Andrea. So today we're going to go through quite a few topics for business licenses. We'll kind of give you like a business licenses 101, just so we can level set, you know exactly what we're talking about, how you can manage your business license portfolio, business license service providers and your tax or legal departments, how that relates to business licensing. And then we'll introduce you briefly to Avalara's license management solutions, which is a software platform as well as an outsourced version of the management of your licenses. And then we'll take some questions from there. So hopefully we'll leave enough time. So business licenses 101. So there's all types of business licenses, but we like to put them in 3 categories: business licenses, permits, and tax registrations. So they're all slightly different. They all have slightly different requirements. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Andrea to just go through each one of those topics and kind of give us the lay of the land on each type of business license. So let's start with business licenses, Andrea.
Yep. Thanks so much. So business licenses are basically the local and actually every level of government's way of keeping track of who is doing business within their jurisdiction. And this is for 2 functions primarily. One is for consumer protection, and the other is a revenue driver for those governments, similar to a tax. And this is basically a tax on the business. And there are going to be, thousands and thousands of different jurisdictions involved, as well as our company manages about 200 different license types. So almost every business needs a license to do whatever it is that they do. And there are different rules and regulations for acquiring and maintaining those licenses. Second type of typical permission slip, if you will, to do business in an area is under the heading of permits. And permits are typically going to be things that have to do with the physical location. And so, for example, fire, alarm, sprinkler, sewer, those types of things where there's going to be a one-time installation, and that's kind of overseen by usually the building department, but there are often other agencies that are going to govern those permits. What makes it a little complicated is that each jurisdiction may call whatever it is that they're imposing a different name. So you may have something that says business tax permit and it's really a business license, or you may have something that's called a license that's really actually a one-time issuance for a permit. So these are high-level categories. Each jurisdiction is going to have its own designation. The last category that we typically include within the scope of licensing is actually tax registrations. So these are typically required in order to set up accounts with the various agencies, departments of revenue, things like that, or agencies like that, where you are going to be remitting taxes on an ongoing basis. So the initial registration is to set up the account, and then there's going to be compliance requirements going on from there. And those are the high level categories.
So we've been noticing that sales tax registrations, a handful of states have been requiring that they renew with another fee, which is different than it used to be. They used to always be perpetual. Do you see that as like a trend that's going to carry through to other states? Easy money,
it may,
right?
and yeah, I definitely think that may become more common. Right now, I believe it's 8 states currently that have some kind of renewal requirement, but as more companies have to register for sales tax because of the Wayfair decision back in 2018, the departments of revenue are looking at just the registrations alone as a revenue driver. So yes, I do think that might change over time. And again, as more excise taxes and as more other kinds of taxes come into being for different products like vaping, things like that, we are going to see changes even in the most basic things that have been set in stone for many, many years.
Right. So bottom line here is every business needs a business license. It's just a matter of how many.
That's pretty
Right?
much it. You've got that exactly right.
All right. So moving on. So you alluded to this on the last slide, how many jurisdictions there are. And we, Andrea and I work in this space every day. We speak to each other all the time. And it's astonishing how many jurisdictions there are. Can you talk a little bit about how that makes it so complex for the business owners to deal with?
Absolutely. So we are a nation of a lot of independent agencies. And as everyone knows, the US has 50 states, but maybe people don't actually realize that in addition to the states, there are local and county level agencies or authorities that have certain powers granted to them by the state for local governance. And so we're tracking currently, there are about 3,000 counties and 35,000 municipalities in the United States, all of which impose some kind of license or permit that we talked about before. So it can be, the local zoning permit. It can be the county health department imposing a license on a restaurant. It can be the state monitoring some high-level regulated professions such as architects, engineers, accounting, things like that. So there are all kinds of government, rights or authority to impose these permission granting exercises, and they do it by issuing licenses. So they basically issue the license and then monitor and maintain those licenses to make sure that they know who's doing business, what kind of business they're doing, and and make sure that they're constantly keeping it up to date. To add to that, there are actually thousands of special purpose districts that you may have heard of, fire, police jurisdiction, that also have to fund themselves, and therefore they also have a hand in the pot of the businesses and will issue some type of permit or registration as well. So we're really tracking far more than 35,000 municipalities at this point with that overlay of the special purpose districts. And those special purpose districts have very specific needs, and therefore they're limited in what they can impose. But nevertheless, a business that finds itself within their jurisdiction needs to be prepared and needs to be ready to comply with the laws. And what's unique about, or at least interesting about the US, is that all of these agencies act completely differently from each other. So there may be, some commonality at the state level across industries. For example, the mortgage business is fairly common, the way the states regulate the mortgage lenders and mortgage brokers. But once you get beyond the states, and even among states, across states, you're going to have so many differences, so many nuances, so many unique imposition rules that there's almost no commonality across the jurisdictions, and then even less commonality across the license types that each of the jurisdictions can administer. So it's a lot to keep track of, but that's what we do.
Yeah, and sometimes it's really hard for our customers and clients to really even know. Do you remember that circumstance we had with a collision repair company, and there was a special license in a jurisdiction for the state police to come in and inspect the collision repair to make sure it wasn't a chop shop? So there's all these weird types of requirements.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. And then, similar to that, for example, there are a lot of retail businesses that take trade-ins, and because they're taking trade-ins, they fall under the rules of secondhand dealing, those rules were actually created to prevent theft and fraud in the pawn shop business. So, those regulations, including having your, salespeople fingerprinted and how you're keeping track of the goods that were returned or traded in, all relate to really theft and fraud prevention, and impose very unusual and very unexpected rules on the businesses that are doing something as simple as taking a trade-in. So, yeah, each of these licenses are kind of conceived in one way and then sometimes imposed in other ways.
Right, right. And one other point to make here, if you could elaborate on, it's not necessarily a brick and mortar location, right? Locations
Yeah,
can be
that is very true.
anything.
In the age of electronic commerce, e-commerce, and in the age of servicing, this service businesses, all bets are off. Some of our licensing statutes were written in the 1950s, 1960s, where business was done a very particular way in a brick and mortar location, a store that you could walk into. But obviously, over the last 70, 80, 90 years, businesses have morphed in ways that nobody could have imagined. And now we're talking about nexus in terms of business licensing. So the cities and municipalities that created or sort of started their licensing journey later in the latter half of the 20th century and now in the past 24 years, they've drafted the language of their statutes to be much broader and to attract or basically give them the ability to impose their license fees on people shipping goods into their district or sending a repair person into their district, and really have expanded the concept of a business license jurisdiction and who would be pulled into that jurisdiction. So that's a great point. There's a lot of complexity, especially around businesses that ship goods everywhere, when they might hit a threshold that would put them in the crosshairs of a local jurisdiction for their business license.
Right. Right. So that's actually a good segue into the next section. So what I would like to do is sort of like work our way up from easy to and ratchet it all the way up to hard, and just sort of walk through some industries that we often encounter and customers, clients we speak with. So let's start at software. I mean, generally not too complex, but there are some licenses, right?
Yeah, typically, as a general rule, almost every business needs a license where their primary location is. So if you have some kind of software business, at a minimum, depending on the statutes of your locality, there might be one general business license that you have just to have the right to conduct your business in the borders of your location. Your risk level is low, very hard to find software businesses unless you're doing a lot of very obvious advertising. And so the resource allocation for this kind of work is relatively low. It's kind of paying another bill, maybe a little bit of a hassle to get the first time you get the license, the initial application, maybe a little bit complicated. It's a government form, like all government forms. There's a lot of detail, a lot of data. Some of the stuff you may think is not really relevant, but they want it anyway. Information is power. So the initial form may be a little bit of a challenge to get over. But once you have the license, it's basically paying a bill to renew it every year or every couple of years.
Okay. All right. So let's ratchet it up a notch here. Retail.
Okay,
so
retail.
Generally, yeah, if they're selling clothes or accessories, one thing, but what if they start adding candy bars out at checkout?
Yeah, it's very true. So even at the most basic product that you don't think is particularly regulated, like what could be, what would need to be a consumer protection concern for a clothing retailer? Not much. I mean, hopefully they're doing their business, appropriately. And so they do need to register. If they're in a brick and mortar location, they need to register for the local business license. But here we get back into the trade-in concept. So they might have a secondhand dealer license. Okay, maybe you're not trading in clothing, but you might be trading in television or some other computer or something else like the Best Buy model. And then we also have something called weights and measures for a regular retail business. And what weights and measures is basically a holdover from the days where business was conducted using scales. So typically the Department of Agriculture or another governing body in a state would be very concerned for consumer protection purposes to make sure that the scales were weighing properly, scales were weighing honestly. Obviously, there aren't that many businesses that use scales, although there still are. Try to buy a bunch of chain link in a sporting goods store and you may have your purchase sitting on a scale. But really what that has morphed into now is what is called weights and measures / point of sale, so POS. certification. And what that is that you could have, not every state has this, but many states do, many counties do, have an inspector coming in to test your POS system, your cash registers, your scanning system to make sure that the barcodes that the system is scanning is coming up with the right price, et cetera, et cetera. And this is, again, a consumer protection measure to make sure that your average consumer is not being cheated or being charged the wrong price for the goods that they are buying. Once you get into candy bars at the register, you're all of a sudden in another whole level of licensing, because food is one of those products that has a level of consumer protection. You want to make sure that the food is fresh, not expired, et cetera, et cetera. And in those cases, even just selling packaged food may incur the need to have a food license. So even at a general retail store, in addition to what's on the list, you'll also have an alarm permit that has to be, renewed potentially. You'll also potentially have, even, if you had a candy machine or even not a candy machine, even like one of those little merry-go-rounds at the front of the store that needs an amusement license. So as soon as you walk into a store, you're going to be faced with the need for a license.
Yeah, and I can't walk into any store anymore, Andrea, without looking around and saying, "Oh, license. That needs a license." If there's a gumball machine, I'm like, "Oh, does it have a sticker?"
Yeah, you got it. You get very sensitized to that.
Let's keep going. Yes, you do. So now we start to get into some, this is where restaurants start to really pick up the level of licensing. Because think about it, if you go and eat something at the restaurant and you get sick from it, that's a problem. So there's lots of licensing required.
Right. And typically when you're in a restaurant, you're obviously you're in a brick and mortar location having an experience. So you're still going to have that same layer from the earlier slide of the general business licenses, perhaps the POS system for the cash registers. You're still going to have those basic licenses, alarm, et cetera, et cetera. But now we're layering in a different level of consumer protection just on food, even if you don't sell liquor. Just on food, there are a number of different licenses that could come into play. There's that general food license, usually imposed by the Department of Health. But depending on the layout of your restaurant, you might have a sidewalk cafe, and that needs a permit because technically you could be blocking pedestrian traffic. So they want to make sure that you're not expanding your tables out into the right of way. And so there's a permit for that. And then depending on, again, what state you're in, there may be a frozen dessert license if you're selling ice cream. So it can really, even, based on your menu, you may have to submit your menu to the Department of Health so they can determine what licenses and endorsements they're going to layer on to the right to run a restaurant within their county or their jurisdiction. Once we get into the sale of, the pouring, the sale of liquor or, beer, wine, or liquor, that's yet again another area that needs a license. And alcohol is one of the most highly regulated products out there and sales out there. And you need special tips training for your servers. There's a whole slew of regulations around the right or the ability to sell beer, wine, or alcohol or liquor, even whether you're pouring or whether you're selling bottles of wine, etc. So all of those things in a restaurant, and you've got your grease hoods in the back, and you've got your fire extinguishers that you need to have ready. So all of those things create a much more complex licensing profile for a restaurant business or a chain of restaurants. Other things that you might have to deal with are certifications, as I mentioned before, tips training for your servers, food handling for your food managers. They might have an inspection violation that you want to keep track of. So all those things that have to do with running the business, there's a lot of paperwork involved. And as you get into the restaurant space, your license compliance profile gets higher and higher.
And alcohol and liquor licenses are very expensive and very difficult to obtain. So it's super, super important that you don't let them expire. We've seen that happen where, it's expired and then it's, the restaurant can't serve anymore. When restaurants do BYOB, does that have a certain licensing, or is that why they do it, just to avoid this? It's
actually going to depend on the jurisdiction, but in most cases they do. That is one way, quote unquote, out of the license. But you may still have some other regulations that you need to comply with, like your servers may need to keep an eye on the patrons and make sure that, they're safe, et cetera. So BYOB is one way to get around having a license for an establishment, but it's not necessarily, it may be a plus for the business, but it may also be a minus for the business because they're not getting the revenue of serving those drinks themselves. So I definitely think that, you have to make a business strategy decision on whether or not you're going to serve alcohol. There are pluses and minuses for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now auto body. And this sort of comes into that comment I made about the state police needing to inspect collision places to make sure they're not chop shops. There's a lot of regulation around auto body and auto repair.
Yeah, there definitely is. And again, part of it is consumer protection, and part of it is going to be just, general how you're running the business. If you're running it safely, as you can imagine, there are a lot of chemicals involved, be it paint or be it other, fluids, solvents that have to be monitored. So there may be quite a few environmental type licenses, hazmat type licenses, depending on what level of service you're doing with the auto body. You'll have a vehicle repair license that's typically issued by the DMV of a state. You may have, you may be lending out cars, if you have somebody that has their vehicle in for service, you may be giving out loaners. You may need those kind of licenses if you're having cars and providing them to your patrons. And again, typically, those same physical plant licenses that we talked about before, but further on from there, you're going to have an extra layer or an extra several layers of compliance requirements around the service that you're providing, the prevention of fraud, as we said, with what kind of vehicles are coming in, what are you doing to transform those vehicles? Are you really an auto body repair shop at all, or do you have something happening out the back door? And then again, just maintaining control of those hazardous materials, which becomes another level. And even just washing cars. If you're just washing the car, you might have a special sewer permit or a wastewater permit that you have to comply with, because the government, the local government's going to want to know what you're putting into the sewer system. So there's a lot of different nuances around the collision industry, and as we go up the ladder of compliance requirements and more regulation, the load of those licenses becomes much heavier.
Yeah, and since COVID, we've seen a lot more like mobile auto repair where they're coming to your home, or even like sending out tow trucks to get your car. Talk about how that impacts the licensing, because now you don't have a brick and mortar location. You're actually traveling across jurisdictional lines and providing services in locations where you may or may not have a license.
Right. That's a great point. Even things like the Safe Light auto glass repair type of model, where they're going out and replacing people's windows, windshields, things like that. Yes, actually, when you're going out of your home base, so to speak, and you're actually doing services outside of your original jurisdiction, you may be dinged by those surrounding jurisdictions for licensing, depending on their statutes. And by the way, when you're going out, you're probably driving a truck with your company name on it for advertising purposes, but that makes you more visible to any enforcement agent, any inspector that might be on the road with you. If he sees your vehicle in somebody's driveway or on the roads, and he may actually trigger a thought in his mind, I wonder if that company is licensed within our city. And there you may be, you may get a notice, you may get a summons, etc. So you really need to know where, if you're deploying service technicians or vehicles to help people fix their cars in their home area, you may need to go and get the license, the relevant license for the surrounding jurisdictions, even if you're based out of one city but you're providing services in other cities.
Right. And that's true for so many industries, right, Andrea? Like I've seen
Absolutely.
mobile pet groomers and, lots of mobile services. People are sending out food trucks into different areas. One industry we can't go over every industry, but I think what you were saying relates very much to the construction industry as well, right? When contractors are sent out to other jurisdictions, they might have only one brick and mortar location, but they're sent out to multiple jurisdictions.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, any business that has repair people going out, even if you do an install, you're doing a, HVAC install and you have a repair technician going out the next year and you get paid for that tech visit, that's going to generate revenue in a jurisdiction that you might not have a license. So yeah, I think everything really needs to, you kind of have to have your antenna up about where you might be triggering licenses. And the more visibility you have, if your truck is out there, if your sign is somewhere that people can see, that's when you want to really be more sensitive to getting those licenses.
Yeah. And I recently was speaking to a general contractor, and he indicated in one jurisdiction he was required to list his subcontractors on his license renewal. And so they'll find you, because if you're listed as a subcontractor, the assumption is you did something for revenue.
Right. And again, this is all for consumer protection. You don't want people building bridges that won't stay up, or even building buildings that won't stay up.
Yeah, right.
But,
right.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right. So let's get up to this is the mother lode, I think. Supermarkets and convenience stores. This is a great example, because when I first started here, doing this type of work, I'm thinking, how difficult could it be? But when you think about a supermarket, you have a dairy license, you have an egg license, you have a meat license, you have, you might accept WIC or food stamps, you're selling lottery, you might have a pharmacy, you might have a florist. My goodness, Andrea, this is complicated. Can you talk to this one?
I think you hit almost every high point as far as what happens today. Supermarkets, convenience stores. Yeah, well, depending. I mean, we've grown much further than the local neighborhood grocer, where you're just getting, fruits, vegetables, and some bread. We're talking about mega stores that have every convenience and every, possible good that relates to food and other products in one location. We've kind of changed the way we shop as a society. And therefore, once you walk under that sign, which by the way has a permit, and past those merry-go-rounds, which by the way have permits, you've got tobacco potentially at the registers, you've got a pharmacy possibly in the store, you've got all those products that need a certain level of cold or heat, and all of those things to make sure that they're preserved in the right freshness. So all of those things require licensing. And then of course, if you're outside of a convenience store and there's a gas pump there, that needs a couple licenses as well. Just the pump itself, for making sure that it's ticking away the dollars and cents properly, and just also the ability to have fuel on premises. So everything that we're talking about is just to illustrate the complexity and things that you don't really even think about when you're shopping, but the business owner has to think about.
And then we can even get into sort of the restaurant domain too, right? If they have prepared food and they have a sit-down little market where you can eat that prepared food, or they have a coffee shop in the location.
Yeah, you're gonna hit something somewhere. So definitely have to be very, very sensitive. Know what you're selling. You want to bring in a new product. If you're on the operations side of things, you better know if that needs its own license. If you're washing vegetables, that needs its own license potentially, or at least its own permit. If you're just putting out vegetables in bags that you got from the distributor, it's a different story. So yeah, there's a lot of nuances here. But I think we need to move on, because we've got a lot more to cover.
Yep. Okay. All right. So next poll question, I'll turn it over to Ashley.
Thank you. Yes, you should see the next poll question on your screen right now. The question is, how would you rate your current business license compliance workflow? We have some options from great to terrible, so you can make your selection and hit submit, and we'll show the results in a moment.
And after seeing what Andrea and I just presented with all the licenses that you could potentially need, I wonder if some people might have thought it was great and it might be going down to maybe average after seeing all that.
It's a possibility, yeah. Okay, we'll give you just a couple more seconds. Okay, going on to the results. So Most people are feeling average to good. Any surprises here, Vicki or Andrea?
No.
Well, I'm happy for the people who think it's great, but this is pretty typical.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, this is typical.
Perfect. All right, I'll pass it back over to you.
All right. So let's get into how do companies manage their license portfolio. So this slide is just talking about, a strategy. What is the strategy? First, you have to figure out who's going to own the business licenses. And we often find it's spread out across the organization. So that leads to problems because not everybody knows what's going on. So the first thing you need to do is figure out who's going to own it. And maybe it's not you in-house. Maybe you want to outsource it to an expert to handle your licenses. Then you just have to make sure everybody is really invested in the process, that they're not going to take the renewals for granted. We often hear stories of decentralized license management where the renewal goes to the store, the manager in the store opens it, doesn't know what it is, chucks it in the garbage. Everybody needs to know that there is this process going on. M&A, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about this, but if you're acquiring companies, if you're growing by acquisition, the M&A process is very important. You really need to do your due diligence and make sure that the licensing is appropriate. And there's all different reasons of, or why or how you would need to change a license or get a new license or just do a name change. But that is very, very important to your M&A. And researching your business license triggers. What Andrea was referring to, if you're crossing jurisdictional borders and now you have gross receipts in a jurisdiction, you need to know what those triggers are that are going to require that you get a license. And then, of course, having good data. Data is key. Good data hygiene is key. So you need something a little bit more robust than just an Excel spreadsheet to keep track of all of this information. And as you grow, your licenses grow with you, so it becomes quite the project. So with that, we are going to talk about some solutions. So what to look for in a business license service provider versus software. So there are options out there. From a software perspective, you could do a self-serve type of product, have software, manage it yourself, versus outsourcing the process. So with that, let's talk a little bit about that, Andrea. Like where are those lines? What makes sense? Talk a little bit about doing the self-serve model with software.
Right. It's a great tool. You can have a tool that will help you consolidate all the information that you need to have for your company to continue running smoothly. And the reason for this is that licenses, or licensing in general, we have found to pretty much be the redheaded stepchild of business processes. People are aware that there's a compliance need, but it's often not centralized, or even if it's somewhat centralized, there are multiple people involved with getting the information required to do the actual license renewal or get the license in the first place. And that's because of that, array and the, non-homogeneous nature of licensing, where one license might be based on inventory and you need to speak to your operations people, whereas another license might be based on the number of employees at a location and you need to speak to your HR people, to the next license that might be based on gross receipts and you need to speak to your accounting people. So with a good, solid tool, you will have the capability to first of all, to corral all the information, to calendar your renewals, your licenses when they need some type of action, track different parts of the process, where we're up to in the process, and also hopefully have a means to communicate and gather information from your coworkers, your teammates, your other stakeholders in the company, and other departments that you might not talk to for any other reason except for license compliance needs. So those types of features, that strong calendaring, that strong reminder system, the ability to generate reports so that all the stakeholders going up to the C-level understand how they're doing in terms of license compliance, that could reflect on, do we need something? Do we need to change how we're doing it? Should we bring in other people? What are the holdups? What's going on Do we have problems in a jurisdiction? Are we seeing a lot of violations? This actually gives your higher up, stakeholders a window into the health of the business in terms of compliance. And so, having a tool beyond a spreadsheet is critical in this day and age as businesses spread out, as they start shipping to different jurisdictions, as they change the way they do business, and really expose themselves to more jurisdictions, more rules, more nuances, more flavors. New products require new licensing. So anything that you're doing to grow your business, be it by territory or by products or services, it just increases the need to have a good way to manage the right to continue to do that business.
And if I could just add one point on there, generally, as she said, the redheaded stepchild of business, but also the person who does it usually drew the short straw. So when you have an Excel spreadsheet, it kind of becomes a single point of failure, right? Somebody drew the short straw, they're doing it for the last 10 years, then they decide they're going to retire. Nobody knows what they're doing. So having a good system, a good automated digitized system gives you, no single source of failure any longer. Everybody knows what's going on with those licenses. All right, so what to look for in a service provider. So sometimes I hear this all the time, every day, Andrea, we just don't want to do this. We just do not want to handle these licenses. What should they be looking for?
Right. So businesses typically don't go into business to do compliance. They go into business to make money. And sometimes, the compliance side of things can be a hindrance or can suck up resources that are actually better served doing something else to generate profits. And so what you really want to look at are a couple things. First of all, you want to make sure that a provider, if you're going to outsource this, knows what they're doing. So they have to have a wide body of expertise. They have to know your industry. They have to know what's involved. And they have to understand your company, your culture, and really figure out the best way to work with the folks that are going to be involved, even just tangentially at this point. Once a service provider takes it off your shoulders, still have to have good communication and a good way to minimize the work on the part of the customer. You also want to have somebody that learns your business, becomes a real resource for you. Somebody who owns the job. So you want to have a single point of contact. You don't want to be tossed around from filer to filer or analyst to analyst. You want to really make sure that somebody understands your business, can, kind of forecast what you need, really knows how the inner workings of the company function so that you can get information quickly and hopefully painlessly. Have to understand the capabilities of information sharing, both, reporting out and providing information in. So as mentioned, a lot of variables involved in doing licensing. So you have to have a good communication workflow, how to get information and also how to share out information. And that, those are things that strong providers can offer. Single source of truth, always having that, quality system that's really reliable and, transparent. So you can see exactly what's going on at every time. And hopefully you're offloading your treasury function. So you have somebody else actually going through the ordeal of the checks. Some companies have a terrible AP process where it takes a month or, a long time to get a check generated. And they have to really pull teeth to get that check out the door on a timely basis. So handing over the treasury functions to provider by, funding an escrow account for them to pay the bills out of and then give you reports back so that you can import that back into your ERP system painlessly is also very important. And of course, for every business, security is key. So you want to make sure that your provider has a, vetted system with all kinds of testing and security, make sure that your data is safe.
Perfect. Okay, so business license use cases. Let's run through a couple of these. You want to start with the first?
Yeah, so that's kind of what I alluded to before. Sometimes people get very bogged down in the paperwork, and maybe it's your accounting person really needs to be generating reports and talking to the CEO and the COO and the CFO, and they're bogged down with doing a lot of paperwork for nitpicky things like licenses, violations, things that are paid late, and they cannot do the work that they were really supposed to be doing. And then of course they get upset and toss it over somewhere else. So you got somebody in the legal department doing it or someone else. So there's a real loss of, focus when this type of paperwork gets in the way.
Or if you have like a small company that, you know, owner run, it's a contractor type business, this guy should be out selling business, but he's in the
Yep.
office doing licensing.
Same idea, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
So
then the
this, the
single source
second
of
one is,
failure. Yeah.
yeah, we just had one of those, right? Where the person retired or actually went out on FMLA leave and isn't coming
Yeah.
back, and nobody in the company has any idea what she was doing with that giant Excel spreadsheet.
Right. Yeah. When you have somebody that's the expert, but that expert wins the lottery, they're not looking back. So, so you really want to have a lot of, yeah, you want to have a lot of transparency. You want to have more than one person understanding what's going on and what the risks are, and also what the process is. If there's no process, or somebody has kind of closely held the process and, you know, they've given themselves some level of job security in that way, but at the same time, they've put the company at risk. That's something you really want to avoid. And both the software or an external provider can help with that.
Exactly. Right. Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, companies
Acquisition.
who are
So this is the
constantly
M&A.
acquiring.
Yeah.
Yeah, M&A. So when your business growth comes through acquisition, you have to make sure that you're not inheriting a bag of liability problems from the acquired company. So there are a number of different tasks that can be done, up to and including how the transaction is actually structured. If you're going to be acquiring companies, depending on the structure of the acquisition, you may or may not be triggering more licensing trouble than you need. You may want to audit the target to make sure that they are in good compliance before you inherit their licensing portfolio. And also, you may want to hold back. You may want to have a clawback, or you may want to have a reserve in the deal to make sure that you're covering any potential unforeseen liabilities around licensing. So these are all things you have to be sensitive to. And also relicensing. You don't want to go through a transaction and not be able to do whatever that company was doing on transaction day plus one. You want to make sure all the licenses are in place. If people are leaving and the license is tied to their name, some of the regulated licenses may be tied to an officer or an individual who is not going to continue with the company, maybe a contractor license, and the qualifier is not continuing under the new structure. Those are things that you really have to be mindful of before the transaction date hits, and make sure you have your paperwork lined up so that you can continue doing business seamlessly on day transaction plus one.
Remember the collision company that was growing by acquisition, and they acquired a company, and the zoning changed. They could not. They could no longer do collision type on that site, which was
right. So due diligence, due diligence ahead of the transaction would have uncovered that. They would have known that that company was that building or business was grandfathered, but they're going to lose the grandfathering. They could have structured it to actually buy the entire company assets and liabilities of that one location, and that business technically would have persisted. So there's a lot of tricks of the trade that you could deploy if you have an expert helping you.
Right. And this last one, using outside legal or outside CPA firms, or even your internal legal department, that's a high cost of compliance, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, everybody who bills by the hour will stretch out the hours that they're going to charge you for doing that compliance. So yeah, definitely want to keep an eye on the costs for sure.
All right, excellent. So next poll question, Ashley.
Thank you.
It's going to turn into like speed dating. We're going to start talking a lot faster.
So our third CP question is, how many business licenses does your company manage? So there are several options there. You can select the one that fits and hit submit. As a reminder, this is our third CPE question, and those hoping to receive CPE credit need to answer 3 of the 4. So we'll give you a few more seconds to get that answered, and then we'll look at the results.
And then I'll just set up the next section. So once we're finished with this poll, Andrea, what I would like to do is just sort of explain the offerings that Avalara has. You know, what can we offer our customers from a service as well as a software perspective? Those results make sense to me.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Thanks for answering.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so here we go. So let's talk about services first. This is outsourcing renewals to Avalara.
Right. So when you're outsourcing your business license portfolio, that means you're handing it over to a team of experts Hopefully you'll get one dedicated analyst, at least depending on your volume, that knows your account inside and out. But you actually have a deep bench of professionals behind that person who will be on call to make sure that the portfolio is staying in good standing. So that's existing licenses that need to be renewed or need some kind of level of compliance to make sure that it stays in good standing, including figuring out, how to deal with violations or any other issues, inspections that come up in order to maintain that license in good standing. So there are a lot of parts to that. There's a lot of moving parts. Researching business requirements for new locations, maintaining the license calendar throughout the whole period. Most licenses are annual, some are semi-annual, some are quarterly, and some, of course, go out to 2 or 3 year renewal periods. But you have to have eyes on the dates. Getting the data required in a seamless way to fill out those forms on your behalf, determining the cash outlay that you're going to need, so estimating how much you're going to be on the hook for in fees, tracking the changes in licensing as new rulings come out, paying attention to what's going on in the jurisdictions where you have licenses, sharing progress reports so that everybody has eyes on the level of compliance and any hurdles that have to be overcome or missing information, things like that. And of course, the biggest challenge about this is actually getting the license on the wall. So you have to actually have a certificate posted in many cases, or if you don't have the kind of business that has a wall to post on, you at least have to have the license available to send to vendors or to send to other parties that might be interested. You need to have that certificate. So that's included in this managed service offering.
Okay, so what we also have professional services that are like an adjunct to ALMS, to Avalara Managed Services. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the managed services typically run on the existing portfolio, keeping it in good standing. It's kind of a month-to-month, week-to-week, year-to-year transactional situation. Avalara Licensed Professional Services comes in to fill the gaps for those one-time events that don't necessarily happen on a week-to-week, month-to-month basis, but things that happen much less frequently, such as opening a new store or doing an acquisition, or even divesting, some stores, or changing your product line. If you're going to start offering new products, those are the kinds of things that are not necessarily happening as often, but you still need experts to help you get the licenses in place, make sure you can open on time on your grand opening date. You don't want to be held up because you didn't have the proper licensing and you have to push that opening date. You want to make sure you can open your restaurant. You want to make sure you can open your store. Both of those, all of those things are not necessarily frequent, but even once a year, twice a year, or even once a month or twice a month, you want to have a deep bench of people who can help you get everything, all your ducks, in a row, and make sure that you have what you need to continue or start or continue conducting the business and generating that revenue.
Mm-hmm. And we often see this used for customers who come on board and they just don't know. That person left, they have no idea what licenses they need. They might do an audit and verification. But the next product that we talk about, Data Query, that's more in line for those contractors who are going into jurisdictions, right? Just have no idea. So talk a little bit about this.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're seeing is that over half of the licenses that are out there in those 35,000 jurisdictions are now gross receipts based. And they basically made the language as broad as they could so that almost anyone who's earning a certain amount of money in their borders are going to have to get the license. So that it's a revenue generating tool for the authorities, for the governments. And so they've made it very easy to fall into their definition of doing business in the jurisdiction. And so what we have created is a data query where we can take your list of service areas, the list of where you're delivering goods, even if you don't have physical locations, or if you do have physical locations, and we can bump up those addresses against our database to figure out where there is a local or county license. And that will also tell you, what is the license imposed on? Is it imposed on gross receipts or not? Is it imposed on inventory, number of employees, square footage, some other variable? And that gives you a great tool to kind of strategize. First of all, it will buy you a lot of no's. There's no license here, so you're good in those locations. And it'll also help you strategize how to get into compliance. Let's tackle the ones that are highest revenue, the gross receipts ones, the things that have the most financial risk associated, and it'll help you get a roadmap together of how to get into compliance if you're not in compliance. So that's a very low cost, good tool that we can offer to help you figure out where you may need licenses.
And then go from there to figure out how we can help get the licenses they need.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about M&A quickly.
Yeah, so I touched upon it before. There are, we did a survey a couple of years ago where we had, 68% of the people were aware that governmental licensing was, part of their due diligence. And then a whopping 32% really didn't have it on their radar. And that can cause problems. And, even just the timing of transactions, I can tell you, can create issues for businesses. So I'll just give you a couple of real life examples. We had a business that was going to go through a tax structure change, which would create the need for new licensing. So it wasn't even a merger and acquisition. They were just changing the way they were organized from a tax perspective. And they didn't want to do it around the Christmas holiday because they didn't want to disrupt their ability to sell in their busiest season. So they actually timed the transaction to happen, the change to happen after the holiday season. Similarly, with mergers and acquisitions, you want to make sure that, as I mentioned before, the target business is compliant and in good standing, so you're not inheriting anything bad, and you want to make sure that you can do business the day after the transactions. I kind of covered this before, but it's a big area. Yep. People don't really pay attention to it, but it's really critical.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get to our last poll question. Ashley, if you could take that, and then we'll have a couple of minutes for some questions.
Yeah, perfect. This is the last poll question. Would you like to speak with an Avalara representative? So if you are interested in anything we just covered in that last section, click yes, and we will follow up with you.
Can we keep talking while they're doing that? Yep.
We sure can, yeah.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions in here. What are the 8 states that require renewed sales tax reg? I'll see if I can get this right, Andrea, correct me if I'm wrong. It's Alabama, Arizona, Rhode Island, Washington, Alaska, Colorado, Wisconsin, and Oklahoma. First
sounds
four
right.
I mentioned are annual, the next 3 are biannual, and Oklahoma's every 3 years. So there's
right.
that. Let's see. Does the software that come? Oh, I don't understand that question. We'll have to skip that one. Do you support nonprofits as well? So, I mean, we do.
Yeah.
There is some licensing for nonprofits. So yes. Yeah, go ahead, Andrea.
Yes. Yeah, and it's going to depend on what activities the nonprofit is doing. But yes, there are licensing and there is licensing involved.
Is it necessary to have a business license before registering for sales tax or sales tax account?
So it's a great question. It's going to depend. And in most cases, you need actually a sales tax account before you can get the business license. So, those actually are sometimes interchangeable. One may be a dependency for the other. It's usually the other way around, though. Usually you need a sales tax account before getting the business license, but you actually need to provide the account in order to get the business license.
Here's one that's sort of open-ended. Well, wholesale pharmaceutical licenses, question mark. I guess.
Yeah. Pharmaceutical. Yeah. So the pharma industry is one of the most regulated, obviously, because of the consumer protection element. Obviously, drugs are highly regulated. The distribution of drugs is highly regulated. So yes, there are multiple pharmaceutical related licenses at every level of the business, from the manufacturing to the distribution to the dispensing, across the board. So you have all kinds of licenses involved at the wholesale level as well.
Adjunct to that question is your service extended to healthcare industries, which it is, like pharmaceutical and medical devices? Can you expand upon that?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a couple of customers in those fields, and we do a lot of different things for those companies, including, you can actually use the software to keep track of your pharmacist's licenses, but we do have quite a few different medical device companies, and they have licenses for all kinds of things, not just the devices themselves, but actually the salespeople that go out to the different cities. Those cities need licenses. So, any industry, really every industry has some kind of licensing, and again, because medical devices are again a consumer protection situation as well as pharmacy, those are somewhat higher regulated than your average retail business.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that, Andrea. We're right at the top of the hour. I want to leave a minute for Ashley. If we didn't get to your questions, we will get to them. Some people asked for cost and demonstration. If you want that, please reach out and we can get some demonstration time scheduled and talk about how it's priced and how it's structured. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Ashley.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for your time and expertise in presenting on this. I just have a couple things to close out with. For those who wanted to qualify for CPE, you can download your certificate if you met the requirements. And if you don't have a chance to download it now, you will receive it in a post-event email later today. Also in the post-event email, you'll receive a link back to this console you're looking at, and you can watch the on-demand recording and get the slide deck. And as a quick reminder, Avalara Crush is coming up this fall. It's a great opportunity to learn, network, and have some fun in Austin. So check it out at avalaracrush.com. And thank you all for joining us. That concludes today's webinar.
Yeah, definitely come to Crush. Andrea and I